Before we begin the video, if you've been getting value out of this channel, please consider supporting High Americana via Patreon, linked in the description. At $3,000 a month, you will help me make this a full-time job and can also request historical content to be made. Thank you.
And now, a passage from A History of the Northern Peninsula of Michigan and Its People by Alvah L. Sawyer, from Chapter 16, The Lumber Industry. Michigan has been notoriously a lumber-producing state, and the Upper Peninsula, notwithstanding its buried treasures of copper and iron, the richest in the world for the territorial area, presented possibilities to the early lumbermen equal to the most favorable of lumbering locations. A very large proportion of the territory was heavily timbered, and it is safe to say that if the timber that has been cut in this peninsula was today preserved in live timber growth, it would be worth more than all the wealth of all the farm, city, and town property, including factories of every kind, but not including mines. Ruthless destruction of timber. To the eye of the first lumberman, the stately white pine was about the only kind of lumber worthy of consideration. And as to that, there are men in the peninsula now who commenced lumbering here in the 50s who vouch that in those days the white pine was so abundant, the area so large, and the growth so heavy and tall, that no one thought it could ever be cut. It was a short step from that seeming unlimited supply of one of the most valuable of forest productions to this time, when white pine trees are few in this land of their nativity. The universal idea that the supply was unlimited, the liberality of the government to the degree of laxness in allowing this natural resource to pass in unlimited quantities into private ownership for the mere pittance of $1.25 per acre, and the coming of the period of rapid world development, creating a vast demand for lumber, just as this valuable timber became obtainable, were responsible for a wasteful extravagance almost, if not quite, inexcusable. True, vast fortunes were made by a few men who were in at the opportune time and appreciated the opportunity, and prosperous communities have developed largely as the result of the activities initiated and carried on by them. But had there then been exercised even a small degree of the care and conservatism of the lumbermen of today, as much or more could have been realized as has been, and at least half the standing pine could have been preserved, and standing it would now have a value of 25 to 50 times its original cost. Large tracts of pine timber would cut an average of 250,000 feet per 40 acres, and the government price was $50 per 40, which would be 20 cents per thousand. Good white pine on the stump today is almost priceless, varying according to quality and convenience of access at from $10 to $25 per thousand. The opening of the mines opened also a field for smelting furnaces, which in turn created a demand for charcoal. A number of furnaces were constructed in various parts of the peninsula, and as a result, large areas of hardwood lands were stripped of their timber contents, and the beautiful maple, birch, beech, and other hardwoods were ruthlessly piled into kilns and burned to coal. A stumpage price of 25 cents per thousand bought many a large tract of beautiful hardwoods for charcoal purposes as late as the 70s, which if standing today would be worth at least 15 times that amount. But the era of charcoal blast furnaces was short, for the owners of timber land soon learned that the methods adopted by the lumbermen would make quick work of the white pine, and that then other woods must take its place. The peninsula contained a very large variety of woods, many of which have proved valuable for lumber, shingles, etc. As already mentioned, pine was the timber to which value was first given, and it is true that as to most sections of this peninsula, other timber standing on the land with pine was not reckoned in fixing the value of the land. In fact, for years after government lands came on the market at $50 per 40, few 40s were purchased except for the pine that grew thereon, and in the mining countries except for the prospects of mineral. It was many years after the mills of the peninsula began active operations before hemlock, now a valuable lumber product, was given any recognition in the making of transfer values, and it is only within the last 30 years that cedar lands came into good demand, though they have been now in large part cut over. Industry founded in 1850. Prior to 1850, very little was done in the way of lumbering in the Upper Peninsula, and for very good reasons. either of several of which is sufficient. In the first place, settlement of the adjacent states was so little advanced that they made slight demand for lumber. And next, transportation facilities were inadequate, but perhaps the best reason is found in the fact that until the government land surveys had been completed and the lands put upon the market, there was no way to obtain title to the timberlands. This last mentioned obstacle being removed close to the half-century mark, the decade from 1850 to 1860, saw large purchases of timbered lands and the construction of numerous mills. Prior thereto, there had been small mills constructed at various places, principally to accommodate local demand, but furnishing some surplus to be sent to such market as could be obtained. For those mills, the timber, of course, had to come from the public lands. In those days, the river and harbor improvements and the magnificent freighting vessels of today were not even dreamed of, and such lumber as was shipped was, as a rule, loaded twice, first on a lighter that transported it to and delivered it upon the sailing craft anchored in deep water to receive it. Of those early mills, mention will be made in the histories of their various localities, and it should be considered that lumbering in this peninsula, in a commercial sense, had its beginning about the year 1850 to 1855. Importance of Menominee District. At the present time, and for years past, the lumbering business is and has been distributed all through the peninsula, on railroads and rivers, as well as at lake ports, but in the beginning of the industry, it was almost wholly confined to points along the lake at the outlet of drivable streams. Menominee has at all times in the history of lumbering in the Upper Peninsula been, and still is, the most important point in this industry, and the south and southeast shore of the peninsula has been the scene of a very large percentage of all the lumbering that has been done. This has been the natural result of the physical construction of the country, which, as has already been described, drains the territory from the watershed within a few miles of Lake Superior, south to the waters of Green Bay. So too, Menominee has been the principal lumbering point because, from its location at the mouth of the Menominee River, it has jointly with Marinette on the Wisconsin side had the supply of timber from the vast area drained by the Menominee and its numerous large tributaries, among which are the Brule, continuing on the state boundary, the Sturgeon, Paint, Iron, and Little Cedar on the Michigan side, and the Wasaki, Pike, and Pembine on the Wisconsin side. Nearly all this large territory was natural pine country, but in a considerable part of it, the pine of most excellent quality was interspersed among a fine growth of hardwoods. There were many large tracts of solid pine growths, and throughout the swampy portions, solid bodies of cedar and tamarack. Cedar of fine quality was also found growing among the hardwoods in many parts of the country. The Escanaba is the next river of importance in this connection, and this too, with its numerous tributaries, has contributed vast quantities of lumber to the commerce of the world. Other rivers of importance that have served as nature's highways for the transportation of her products to points on the Green Bay shore are Ford, Manistique, and Cedar rivers. The lumber industries of each receives specific mention in the history of the respective counties. The Ontonagon is probably the most prominent from a lumbering standpoint of the rivers flowing north. Improved transportation facilities. At first, only the timber that was close to the streams was considered desirable, but as operations proceeded, transportation facilities improved, and the demand for lumber increased. Longer hauls of logs to the river were made, and interior mills were constructed at convenient junction points of rail and water, or on railroads in lumber districts distant from rivers. Logging railways were also constructed on which to haul the timber growing in considerable tracts distant from the river, which last method has been very generally adopted by the large mills in the interior to haul logs direct to the mills, as well as by river lumbermen to put into the river such logs as are so far from a waterway that rail hauling is less expensive than that by teams. Now and then. A very recent innovation in log hauling is the use of monster traction engines, by means of which vast sleigh trains of logs are hauled from forest to mill on ordinary logging roads without the use of either tram or rail. This enables the operator to cut a road into the heart of a timber body of any kind or kinds of timber cut the land clear of every marketable variety and haul the entire product to his mill or market. A number of these powerful engines are now in use in the peninsula, and their use is nicely illustrated in the accompanying cuts, showing the tram hauling the logs from the forest to the rollways near the mill at Cedar River in Menominee County. This method is quite in contrast with the ox team and travois with which early hauling was done, and even with the later methods of heavy team hauling on iced roads, and has its advantages over the logging railway in that it gets more readily into the source of supply. The engine is of great weight and propels its train by means of an endless chain which is run under its heavily weighted wheels.